Good morning, everybody. We are starting a new series today, a 4-week series. The title of the series is No Ordinary Life. And we've got 4 messages lined up around that. And so today is the launch of that. And it's a launch that I believe is one where we're speaking into all of our lives. It's not a group message it's a message for each and every heart to hear, that God is calling us to live lives that are not ordinary. So I'd love you to open your Bible, and I'll introduce today's specific message after we've read the scripture together. But if you can open up to Luke chapter 18, and we're going to read from verse 35 to verse 43. And I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It says here, as he, talking of Jesus, drew near to Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging, and hearing a crowd going by, he inquired what this meant. They told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. And he cried out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And those who were in front rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and commanded him to be brought to him. And when he came near, he asked him, what do you want me to do for you? He said, Lord, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, recover your sight. Your faith has made you well. In verse 43, and immediately he received his sight and followed him, glorifying God. And all the people, when they saw it, gave praise to God. Now, don't move from that passage. I want to just show this amazing transformation that happened in an ordinary town in the Middle East to an ordinary blind man doing what he did every ordinary day. But he had an encounter where his history, which was an ordinary history, collided with the destiny of God. And it blasted him out of a life of ordinary life to a life that was extraordinary. And the contrast in these verses, I just want you to compare verse 35 with verse 43. The transformation, and it's kind of the heart behind the series. But verse 35 says, there was this blind man sitting beside the road begging. So there they were, those things. That's a picture for us of you and me, our lives. Then we have the in-between stuff, this encounter with the Son of David. And then verse 43, I want to point out 5 things that signify a transformed life, a life that's no longer ordinary. Verse 43 says, he recovered his sight, he followed Jesus, glorified God, the people saw it, and they gave praise to God. And I think when this man that used to be blind, when he reached the end of his life, and I don't know whether he had family or children or whatever, but he would be able to reach the end of his life, and everybody that knew him, he'll be able to look back over his life and tell them, I lived no ordinary life. And I want to ask you today that if you were to think of your history up till now, and if you were to think of the years that might still be lying ahead, and we don't know how long that might be, life is fragile. But will you be able to look back over your life and be able to say, I lived no ordinary life for Jesus? And I'm not talking about a life that's extraordinary in a kind of humanistic sense of, go and be somebody that does something extreme in this world and achieves all kinds of things that the world praises. Now, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, will you reach the end of your life and look back and say, I had a collision with the Son of David, and the impact of my life has touched and changed humanity for the glory of God and has turned hearts and eyes towards Jesus, not towards me. I want to ask that of you, and I want to say that immediately I would expect that there are already in your mind, even if you might not acknowledge it, there would rise up questions that say, yeah, I don't really think that applies to me. And so I want to say that this series is aimed at hopefully stirring up an expectation that it does apply to every one of you if you're a follower of Jesus here today. That your very DNA, spiritual DNA, if you've met Jesus as your Lord and Savior, is one where you have been designed to live a life that is not ordinary. And so in this series, we would like to go over various things. But today I'm going to be focusing on the importance, if we are going to go anywhere with this that I'm talking about, it's got to start with it. We've got to get to a place where I will believe God for the impossible, which is the title of this morning's message. Believing God for the impossible. Now, I know that title can make you think, well, I must believe God for a miracle. I'm not talking about believing God for a miracle that maybe you need in your life. I'm talking about believing God for the impossible, where He can take you as an ordinary person and can make your life a life that when you look back at it, and you will be able to say, I lived what I would have thought was impossible. I've been following Jesus. This year it will be 40 years. Got saved in 1984. And I can honestly say, if you were to have told me 40 years ago that you're going to follow Jesus, and this is the things that Jesus is going to use you to do and whatever, I would have said, that's impossible. Because I knew how ordinary person I was. There was nothing in me. There was nothing, no qualification, no kind of thing that would anyway be able to, not even my abilities would be able to line up with that. But looking back, I can look back and say, but somehow I believed God for the impossible, and He did far more than that. And so I want to say the starting point is I want to challenge your belief system about yourself. Do you believe that God can take your life and make it a life where when you look back, you say, I lived a life that was seemingly impossible, but I've lived that for Jesus. And so I want to go through 3 points today about how do we believe for the impossible. The first point is, I've got to believe that this is my calling. I have been called to this. And so I want to firstly take the most obvious thing, and you'll all be able to immediately say, yes, yes, yes. Because if you know anything about the Bible, I can assure you that you will agree with me immediately, that you will not find one person that lived an extraordinary life for God that started out as an extraordinary person in kind of who they were. We find every single person, whether it be a shepherd looking after sheep like David, whether it be a Lydia that was a dealer in purple cloth, that's what she was, ordinary people with problems, with battles, with resistance, whether it be a tax collector that had sold his soul to the Romans there, or whether it be a zealot, a political activist that was out to try and overthrow the government, whether it be, these are people that Jesus found along the way, and He called them a fisherman. And says, come and follow me, and I'll give you an extraordinary life. I'll make you fishers of men. You see, every single encounter between God and people like this blind man starts off with ordinary people like you and me. And I want to say, we can honestly believe with all of our hearts that this is who God has designed you to be. And so I need to believe that. So that's the starting point. Now, the problem is to believe it is a battle. We are going to touch on that in my third point. I'll talk about this battle. But we need to realize that it's almost every Christian will constantly come up with this pressure to settle for an ordinary life. And it will come time and again. It might come in waves. It might come that you have a season of actually living in a full experience of this. But every now and then we're going to reach points, turning points, crossroads in our lives, like this blind man, that was a day where Jesus came through, and it was a crossroad, and we will be faced with two options. And I want to use some illustrations to just describe the two options, and you're facing them right now. So am I. We're all sitting here. We have two options. And the two options I want to say we're facing is we have the option to continue in a way of living that is just ordinary. Or we have the option to actually break out of that and say, I want to live a life by the grace of God and the power of God that is extraordinary. And so we are facing those two options. And I want to use just some illustrations about these that might paint the picture of these two worlds, because we all face them to some degree or another. But there's a letter to the Hebrews. It's in our New Testament. And in this letter, just to give you some background about it, is that the letter to the Hebrews was written to Jewish people that had met Jesus and had become Christians, but they lived in Jewish community with Jewish family and relatives and friends. They probably worked at Jewish businesses and Jewish companies, and their whole culture, they used to go to the synagogues, their whole culture, their social life and everything was wrapped up in them being Jewish. Now they met Jesus, and it was a radical encounter by all accounts. These people were saved powerfully by God, and they started out radically in a world that blasted them out of things that was part of their culture, and those things were addressed by Christ. But the pressure that was placed on them by their society was to tone it down. You know, this Jesus you keep talking about, if you keep on like that, you know what, I'm going to fire you. Or, you're not going to get invited to the party, the family gatherings, the weddings, or whatever the case might be. Society began to put pressure on these people. It wasn't just persecution of a torture and thrown to the lions. It was a social pressure that wanted to squeeze these people. And you find, if you read through Hebrews, that the kind of pressure they came under was, you know what, you're going to have this Jesus as one of your prophets. As long as you just tuck him nicely underneath Moses. Just keep Moses right up there and tuck Jesus underneath there. And then you'll be okay, Then you can still come to the synagogue and the party. Just acknowledge that, he's a great prophet, whatever. If you want to do that, you can find how the writer to the Hebrews challenges all of these things. They just say, just come and still practice all the sacrificial ceremonies and all of those. And then you can go and do your Jesus stuff somewhere else, but just tone it down. And this pressure was intense upon them. And the end of the letter to the Hebrews, the writer kind of sums it up with this picture of two options they were facing. And I want to read it to you in Hebrews 13, verse 12 to 14. And he says to them, Jesus suffered outside the gate. And he's referring to the fact that Jesus was crucified outside of the town. They didn't crucify him right in the city. They crucified him outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Then verse 13, therefore, let us go to him outside the camp. And those are the words I want to emphasize. Outside the camp. It's a metaphoric picture that the Hebrew writer was trying to tell them. I want you to be a people that, like Jesus, who set the example for us, who even in his death was crucified outside the camp, outside the ordinary. Let us be people like that. Let us go to him. That's where he's still working today. He's working outside of the camp. Let us go to him and bear the reproach that he endured. For we have no lasting city, but we seek a city that is to come. And so the writer is saying to them, you can conform to the ordinary. And he uses the term the camp. I want to say the camp represents the ordinary life. It's the life kind of where you submit your Christianity and you submit, in a sense, this dream of having a life that lives and expects the impossible. And you tone it down, and you just kind of have far less restrictions in society, far less pressure. We can tone it down. And so we have this camp and outside the camp as two options. And I want to say the camp for me represents three things. I've alluded to them already. But I want to, as I mentioned, the picture that the camp represents, to actually bring it into your day, bring it into your life. What might these things mean in your situation? But the camp represents conformity. Conformity to society, conformity to family, conformity to peers, conformity to comforts. And it's something that, in a sense, brings perhaps seemingly less ructions. But it brings us to a place where our life descends to something we were never made for. Sadly, one finds Christians in a place where they've been so kind of pressured by the ordinary life, ordinary things that we have to do, that they get to a place where they have no more expectation for God to actually do the impossible. And somebody once said, you can meet Christians that when you compare their expectation to their atheist neighbor, you will find their expectations are basically equal. Sometimes Christians have just as little expectation for God to intervene, for God to do the impossible, than what their atheist neighbor might have. You see, and that's the place where we've been so conformed that we're kind of living in a society where there's no difference anymore. So I want to ask you, what does that represent in your life? What are the things that want to squeeze you into their mold? The blind man that we read about, he came under the same pressure. Don't rock the boat. You've been sitting here every day for who knows how long, begging here. You get your tips, you get your bits of food that people might throw at you. Yeah, you are begging. Just stay there. Life will carry on as normal. Don't bother this guy coming through. Just keep them. They wanted to quiet him. But he wouldn't. He wouldn't submit to the conformity that would come on him. And he said, no. Son of David, have mercy on me. Son of David, have mercy on me. And he cried out all the more. The more they tried to put pressure on him. And it's a lesson for us. Are we living in the camp? Are we saying that's not where I want to be found? The second thing the camp represents, firstly, conformity. Secondly, it represents abandonment of God's dreams that he put in your heart. I believe every single child of God, God has put dreams in your heart. Dreams of being used by God to make an impression for him in this world. I don't believe there's any Christian that's come to Jesus, given their life to him, that hasn't got something stirred in their hearts that I want to make a difference in this world for Jesus' glory. I believe it was put there the day you got saved, if not even before. God's put those dreams there, but the camp represents where we abandon the dreams. We no longer dream of actually being somebody that can make people turn their heads to Jesus like this blind man. And his life ended in a place, the verse ended in a place where people saw him, glorified God. And so we need to remember that. A little quote from Bill Johnson. And he says, it is abnormal for a Christian not to have an appetite for the impossible. It has been written into our spiritual DNA. And I think that's a really relevant quote for us. It's abnormal not to have a hunger for the impossible. Because that's who we've been born again to be. We are a people of the impossible. It's impossible for God to save a sinner like me, but he did it. It's impossible for God to use an ordinary person like me, but he will do it. But how's your appetite for the impossible? The third thing, and they're very similar, but the third thing the camp represents is it represents tameness. It's to tame the wild passion that Jesus puts in our hearts, that we find even in this blind man. There was something in there that drew him. And this passage to the Hebrews said, come, let us go out to Jesus, where Jesus is. There's like this pioneering spirit. It's not a settler mentality. It's a stirring in the heart. There's a wildness. And they say that sometimes animals in the circus can be tamed to such a degree that even once you take their chains off, they will still kind of just walk around there, just tamed, conformed, because the pressures of life, pressures of religion, family, whatever the case might be, your own doubts and fears, your own failures, your own disappointments, just tame us right down where we're no longer wild for Jesus. And I'm not trying to stir up some earthly passion. I'll get to that just now. But the camp represents tameness. And so I believe God's calling us out of the camp, calling you and me to say, I believe this is not what I'm designed for. This is not what I'm called for. And it's interesting that they use the analogy, and I want to just emphatically say, I believe no matter where you are in life as a Christian, that Jesus has promised he will never leave you nor forsake you. So I'm not, but there's interesting in this metaphor that it says, let us go to Jesus outside the camp. So Jesus is painted in this picture as being outside the camp. And that's interesting for me, because it actually says that where Jesus is working out his redemptive plan that he's been working since Genesis, and he's going to work right through till we get to the end of time. But if you want to be actively there on the cutting edge where Jesus is, we need to realize the place that it's going to call us to be is outside the camp. And that doesn't mean Jesus will ever leave you. But if you want to be part of that, almost I want to say, that wild, pioneering, cutting edge of what Jesus is doing, it's outside the camp. That's where he's called us to be. And so I want to, at this point, just share something of my story. And I know, you can ask my wife. She said, tell the people how ordinary were and how ordinary you are. So I've got confirmation. There's nothing extraordinary about my life without Christ. If I look through that, I look through childhood photographs, I look through what things, there was nothing extraordinary. I was the perfect example of ordinariness, I think, in every way. I wasn't a leader at school, never became a prefect. I played the 6th team rugby. There were 12 teams, so I was sort of right in the middle. I was not the top academic student. There was just everything about my life. I was the 4th of 4 children. It's irritating to my brothers and my sister. That's how I grew up. Everything about me was ordinary. And yet there was something in me that longed, even as an unbeliever, that longed to meet God. And the longing was not something that I just wanted religion. There was something that I believed in my life. I wanted to be impacted by the living God. I remember even as a little child, I went to Sunday school. And the teacher, I don't remember what he was talking about, but it was something about somebody in the Bible that heard God. And I was little, I must have been 4 or 5. And then we prayed, and I went to the teacher afterwards. I remember this so clearly because of his answer to me. The teacher's name, I think his name was Frank. And I went to him and I said, Uncle, I said, when we prayed, I think God spoke to me. Little ago. And he asked me what I felt God said. And I realized looking back, I don't think God spoke to me, because what I said to him never happened. But I said to him, but the wonderful thing was there was this hunger in me that God's alive and I need to meet him. And he wants to speak to me. And he gave me such a wonderful answer, my Sunday school teacher. He looked at me, put his arm around me. He says, Alan, that is wonderful. And he said to me, you know what? I've been praying. I'm an old man now. I've been praying all of my life that God would speak to me. I just remember it did something in my life that man said to me. There was this hunger. I remember around about grade 9 and 10, I used to go on these Christian camps. And I was kind of a camp leader in one of the camps. And they gave us these little booklets, how you could lead somebody to Jesus. Now, I wasn't a Christian. Looking back, I can see how God was drawing me. But I remember sitting with people and leading them to Jesus with the booklet. Even though I myself wasn't saved, I would go through there. And when they would go, I would take the booklet, go off on my own, and I would go through it myself. I'd go through all the steps, what this little book said. And I would go through and I'd pray it, and then I'd wait and see if something happened. Nothing happened, and I said, no, it's got to be more than this. And then I'd do it again another time. And again, there was this hunger because there was this realization that, you know what? If God is real and God is alive, I need to hear him. I need him to impact my life. So anyway, my hunger for encountering God and having my history change from ordinariness to an extraordinary life just kept growing. So I got more and more involved in my church. I started going to all the meetings I could. I joined the choir. I was the youngest. The next youngest person was like 50 years older than me. But I joined the choir anyway. And I was looking to all the older people in the church, and I was trying to see, is there anybody here that can tell me how I can encounter God, the living God? And the general thing, the feedback I got was constantly this thing of, just tone it down. You'll just end up like all of us. Just go through all the motions of what the church expects you to do, and go through your confirmation and say all the things you got to say. And I did all of those things, but there was nothing. There's no encounter. There's no life. There was something, but there was this longing in my heart. And I got so desperate. Eventually, I went to another church that they told us, don't go there. Those people are weird. Don't go there. But anyway, desperate as I was, I went there. And I remember walking in. I've told this many times, but it is just, for me, an expression of this thing. I walked in the door, and the worship had already started. And I came in right at the back, and there were a few thousand people there, and I remember the faces. It was like a flash photography. My mind, I could still see the faces that day. I walked in, I looked at this, my eyes big like this, and I could see the people in their worship were connecting with God. I could see it. They were not putting on, I could see people were interacting with the living God. It shone out from their faces to an unbeliever walking into the tent there. And I remember it so vividly. And I said, they've got what I need. And I started going and whatever. And I was unsure of the way forward and whatever. somewhere along the line, I don't know how, maybe I found it in the bookshop that they had, but I ended up with a book, and I don't even know if it's a good book, so I'm not recommending it. But it was a book that came across my path at that time. It was written by an engineer, and I was studying engineering at the time. And I had this book, and the book's title was How to Live Like a King's Kid. It's an extremely charismatic book, but anyway, I took this book, and I started to read it. And in every chapter, this engineer would tell about how he'd come out of a life far from God, but then he met God, and how he was having these interactions. He was seeing miracles happening. He was praying for things. He was witnessing to people, and their lives were changing, and he had visions and dreams and all these things. And I was like, whoa, this is what I'm expecting. And slowly on my journey, I eventually got to the point where I'd sorted out in my mind the way to have an extraordinary life. And so when I reached that point, I came to the front one night. And when I came to the front, there was a guy who said, yes, what can I pray for you? I said, right, I'm ready. I said, this is what I want. I want to give my life to Jesus tonight. Number 2, I want to be baptized with the Holy Spirit. Number 3, I want to speak in tongues. So he said, okay, we'll ask for all 3. I remember he prayed for me that night. As he prayed for me, there was this massive awareness that God came and says, you're very ordinary, but I want to show you, I've been hunting you down since you were little. And at every junction, some of them I've mentioned today, at every junction, it was me calling you to a life that I've planned for you. And that night was a collision between an ordinary person, ordinary on every level, that was a collision with the Son of David. And I went home that night, and I knew that Jesus had saved me. And I went home and I had a Bible. I was given a Bible as a prize for good attendance at Sunday school. So I had a Bible at home. And I took the Bible, and I opened it, and it opened on John chapter 14. And round about at verse 21, it says this. It says, and we, talking of God, we will come and we will make our home in your heart. And when I read that, I knew, here inside me, God had come and he'd made his home in my heart. And I remember that day, my whole life was filled with this thing. This is no ordinary life. God lives inside of me. This can't be ordinary. I'm not going to live an ordinary life. This is who I've been called to be. And I know from that day, 40 years on, I look back, that is how I've lived. I said, Lord, extraordinary life. And I want to say to you today, as we're facing these options, that the camp is safe. The camp is, in a sense, easy to fit in there. It doesn't rock the boat. But I want to tell you, it's not who you're called to be. You've been called to live an extraordinary life. There's another aspect of these 2 options that I want to mention, still under this first point. The other points are quick. So there's this one that I've just mentioned, that we're faced with in the camp or out the camp. Where do you want to be? But there's another option, a picture that I want to use. That we're going to be faced with the fact of being overwhelmed by our ordinariness. Or we can go after the one our heart loves. So again, I'm just painting pictures that we're faced with options as Christians along our journey. We can be overwhelmed by our ordinariness. And by our ordinariness, I know that you can go home and look in the mirror and you can see that person. You know everything that person's done wrong, and you know their failings, and you know their weaknesses, and you know their shortcomings and their inabilities. And you can be overwhelmed by that and live there. You can live in the state of, it's me. Let me just be real. This is me, an ordinary person. Or you can follow the one your heart loves. And I'm using a picture here based on something that happened to Peter. Now, it's important to realize, if you don't know about Peter, his actual name was Simon, and his dad's name was John or Jonah. So he was called Simon bar Jonah, or Simon son of John. That's who he was. And Jesus gave him another name. He says, from now on you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church. You might know that passage. But he actually gave him a name that prophesied about his future, that he would be somebody that would see incredible things happening. And so he comes and he starts following Jesus. And Jesus says, I'm going to make you fishers of men and all of this stuff. And he said, fantastic. I'm going to live an extraordinary life. But the way I'm going to do it, I'm going to summon all my ordinary giftings, my strengths, my passions, and I'm going to summon them all. And I'm going to do this for Jesus. Because sometimes when you hear a sermon like this, you think what Alan is saying is, let's all get enthusiastic. Let's get worked up now. We're going to do this. We're going to live for Jesus, a passionate life for Jesus. You see, that's in a sense what Simon helps us all to grasp. It was not at all what we mean. So Simon came and he was spontaneous. He was the first one to respond if Jesus said something. Call me out of the boat, and off he goes walking on the water. It was a spontaneous passion. I won't let you suffer, and all these things. He summoned all his human resources to try to use that to live an extraordinary life. But on the night that Jesus was betrayed, that night, and then going on to the night of his betrayal, the Last Supper, and all those things, he warned Peter. He said, you're going to deny me. No. He says, I love you more than all the others here. I'll never do it. They might do it. It was almost this arrogance. They might do it. They might deny you. But not me. You see, he expected to live the ordinary life by the strength of his zeal and the strength of his passion. And we make a big mistake as Christians if we think the extraordinary life is for the one with the most zeal and passion. And we applaud them and they see how enthusiastic they are. But actually, Peter is an example to us. So that night of Jesus' betrayal, under the pressure, ordinariness failed. Human zeal, passion, determination, vision, mission statements, all those things, boom, they collapsed that night. Everything Peter had summoned to help him to live the extraordinary life disappeared. They deserted him. All those things he hoped would get him there deserted him. And he denies Jesus 3 times in the most humiliating way for him. And the sense of his ordinariness, I can only imagine, must have overwhelmed him. So he goes back to his ordinary living, which was fishing. After the resurrection, we find Peter and the disciples fishing, and Jesus calls him. And then Jesus addresses him, the resurrected Christ, addresses him, and interesting in John 21 where this happens, he addresses him using his very ordinary name. And he says to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And what's he saying? He knew exactly what had happened. He knew that Peter was overwhelmed in his ordinariness, and he says, yes, that's where I need you to be. But it's out of that, without a sense that you're going to live an extraordinary life by your human capacities, that's where I call you. And he uses this word that we know so well. He says, do you love me? Isn't that amazing? Do you love me? The way Jesus calls us to an extraordinary life is he calls us with his love for us that triggers a love for him. And he says, come and follow the one your heart loves. That's why I said, we're faced with 2 options. We can be overwhelmed by ordinariness. So Peter sits there. I've failed. Everything I tried, my best to do, failed. Or I can listen to Jesus and follow the one my heart loves. And Jesus says, come. I'm going to give you an extraordinary life. Go and feed my lambs. How can it be? It's impossible for somebody that's messed up like this. No, come and feed my lambs. Do you love me? But he starts with love. And I want to say it's a critical thing for us to realize that it is love, ultimately, that makes us want to run outside of the camp. It makes me think of the Song of Songs, if you know that book. But there was one of the scenes, the Song of the Songs, about the bride and the bridegroom. The bride is there and her lover comes knocking on her door. But she's kind of slow to get up. She's kind of in bed already, whatever. And he's outside knocking on the door. And she doesn't respond. And eventually she says, my heart's drawn to him. And my heart, my lover, oh. And so she gets out of bed. She goes to the door and she opens it. But he's gone now. And then she goes wandering around everywhere. And people might be asking, what are you doing out here at this time? You should be locked up in your room at this time. What are you doing? She says, no, I'm looking for the one my heart adores. And you see, that thing stands out to me. People want to ask me, what are you doing with your life? Why did you give up your career? Why did you give up this? Why did you do this, that, and the other? Well, it says, I'm looking for the one my heart adores. I want to be there with him. I want to follow the one my heart loves more than anything else. Do you love me more than these? Yes, Jesus will come then. Feed my lambs. You see, that's our calling. That's our place. It works with love. It's our love for Jesus. Because we realize that's where I want to be. And sometimes we let our love for Jesus cool down, and then kind of it becomes equal with so many other things, and then we settle there. But God wants to stir your love for Him today. You see, your love for Jesus isn't your own efforts. The Bible says He loved us first. His love for us awakens love for Him. And it's that love that He wants to draw to call you into an extraordinary life. And just a little quote, I'm sure you've heard it, but sometimes it's helpful to remember. But it says here, God has a tendency of picking up a nobody and making them into a somebody in front of everybody without asking anybody. And I just think it's a lovely picture that, yes, Peter, in a sense, ordinariness overwhelming him. But God has a tendency to take a nobody, say to him, go and feed my lambs, make him into a somebody for Jesus. In front of everybody. Peter stood up in front of 3,000 and testified of Jesus. After having denied Him 3 times, He stands in front of 3,000 and acknowledges Jesus. You see, that's God's way. Do you love me? God's saying to you today, do you love me? Come out of the camp. Come out into the danger zone. Come out of tameness. Come out of conformity. Come out. Come and follow the one your heart loves more than everything. My last 2 points are very quick. There's a promise that goes with the journey of an impossible life, of an extraordinary life. And I've summarized the promise with these 2 words. God's promise to take and make. And I use those words because they're repeated at various interactions where God meets ordinary people. We will often find that He will use either both those words or 1 or 2 of the words. But you remember Abraham, way back in Genesis 12. God comes to Abraham and says, leave your town, leave your family, and come and I'm going to show you a land. You can't see it yet, but I'm going to show you. Come. And then He says, and I will make you a blessing to nations and your descendants as well. Now, his wife was barren. But something in his heart leaps. Because he hears a promise, a dream, that God says, I'm going to make you a blessing to the nations. And he follows Him. He obeys Him. You see, the promise, though, didn't come with a down payment. You know, He didn't bless him right there on the spot and see a massive revival break out in his town. No. He said, come and follow me. And along the way, I'm going to make you what you think is impossible. Your wife is barren. I'm going to make it happen. But come and follow me first. Leave the camp first. Come out and follow me first. And we find the same with the fishermen. Jesus says to them, leave your boats and stuff. Come and follow me and I will make you fishers of men. So they leave and they go. And then there's this process of walking with Jesus. And when you find the apostles, after they died, if they could have a look back over their lives, they will say, God took my life and He made me to be a somebody for Him that was impossible. You see, and that's a promise for every one of us. It's a promise that comes with that. My last point. We need to realize to live the impossible life that God's called you to is going to require a fight. Fight from you. You're going to have to fight for it. It's not going to just land on your lap. There's going to be battles to push you back into the concept of just live an ordinary life. Tone it down. We're going to be faced with those time and again in our Christian walk, and we've got to understand that when they come, we've got to rise up and we've got to take up arms against the pressures that will come on us. Most of the pressures to ordinariness come from within our own hearts and minds. So I'm not talking about fighting people or systems or anything like that. I'm talking about the fact that very much the voices in our own head are the ones that we're going to have to say, but I know that I'm ordinary. And I'm not going to win this thing by stirring up fleshly passions and determinations and whatever. but I'm going to love Jesus with all my heart, and I'm going to follow him. I'm going to make mistakes along the way. I'm going to get disappointed by myself, but I'm going to get up again, and I'm going to go after that. And you're going to have to fight those things. You remember how David drew up the courage to fight Goliath. You remember how it happened. What was the courage that David found? Where did he find it? He found it in the promises of God. Because Goliath was standing on a battle line, and the battle line was in an area that God had promised to give Israel as their inheritance. And the giant will always stand between you and your inheritance that God's promised you. There's always giants there. And the rest of the Israel's army just said, oh, and they didn't fight this. They didn't trust God to say, but it's the promises of God that are being robbed of us. It's not about our own ego and destiny. It's the promises of God. But David came and says, no, this is nonsense. We've got to fight this thing. It's God's promise that's our space there. And that's what your life is. It's your space that God's promised you to live an extraordinary life. But there's giants there that are staring down at you, scary giants. And your giants are unique to you. They're different to somebody else's. So don't compare your giants with mine. But your giant will be your giant, and it'll be a giant to you. It might look small to somebody else, but you're going to have to fight it. And so Paul writes to Timothy, and Timothy had some giants standing in his way because he was a brave young man. He had a testimony in 2 cities. He was a fighter for God, but he had ended up in a very dangerous situation in Ephesus, where Paul had left him. And he was under threat for his life. And historians do say that Timothy was in the end martyred. But he was under threat for his life in that place. And so he was under this pressure. And Paul writes to him this letter, and he says in 1 Timothy 1:18, he says, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies made about you, use them to wage good warfare. He says, take the promises and fight to see them fulfilled in your life. You see, there will always be voices that want to push you back. There will always be people. There will always be disappointments. There will always be awareness of your human frailty. But we're going to have to rise up and fight them with the promises of God. And I want to bring this to parenting. There's many parents here. We have to have the same view of our children that we're bringing up. We're not bringing them up to be ordinary people. And I'm not talking in a worldly sense. We're not bringing them up to be superstars in the world's eyes. No, we're bringing them up to be extraordinary people for Jesus. We've got to realize that's our mission as parents. So we've got to let it affect our parenting. I cannot just build my whole parenting about teaching them to take their normal, natural strengths and to develop them and to do the best with them. And that's all that I ever do. I've got to realize I've got to bring them up in a way where I actually am stirring their hearts that they can be something that's impossible in their natural sense for Jesus. And so we need to have various things in our parenting. We need to have stories to tell them. When they ask, Dad, Mom, I've got this problem. Well, let me tell you a story what Jesus did for me. We need stories like that we can tell our children. We need to help them to see the power of God work in their life. I remember my son had a hearing problem. We took him to the audiologist. The audiologist tested, drew the graph. There was a graph like this, and the graphs was shifted to the one side of where it should be for normal hearing. They couldn't hear certain frequencies. And we had invited Angus Buchan to come to our church years and years ago, before he was so famous, but he came here. Anyway, we got him to pray for my son. They prayed for my son's ear, and I think it was that night, he came the next morning, he said, Dad, something popped in my ear. So I said, can you hear better? He says, I think so. I said, let's take you back to the audiologist. We made an appointment again, it was now months later, went back to the same audiologist. Put him in the chamber there, turned up the stuff, drew the graph, came out. She put the 2 graphs next to each other, the first time we were there and the second time. And the whole curve had shifted back into normal. And she looked at that and she said, you know what? What happened? I said, no, we asked God to heal him. So she says, close the file. She said, no charge for today. I'm not the doctor here. God was the doctor. And she sent us out there. Now, that's a story of the power of God, just one of many. But we need to be parenting like that. We need to be saying, with God, show my kids your power. There's such emphasis on all kinds of natural means and things to get on in life. And I'm not saying ever neglect those, but surely far above that, we're parenting our children to live extraordinary lives for God. So as I bring this to a close, I'd like to pray for us. But more important than that, I want you to be praying for yourself. I'm not here to stir up some kind of human fleshly enthusiasm. I want to pray for you today. But in your heart, it's a cry, a love cry. This thing of an extraordinary life is not a zeal. It's a love cry. Jesus saying, do you love me? Come out of the camp. Come follow me. It's dangerous. There's reproach. It's wild. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to get disappointed. But come. Follow the one your heart loves. Break out of the camp. Break out of the pressures to be ordinary. Break out of the low expectation levels. But you ask that from God today as we pray.